Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Political Tools and Beyond the Headlines. A lot has happened since Barnaby Phillips released his book Loot about the British Army's theft of the Benin Bronzes. Auction houses have stopped sales, museums have returned items, and Barnaby himself has seen a few of those pieces start their journey back to Nigeria. And Germany recently announced to return its entire collection. But still, the UK's British Museum owns some 900 pieces and is holding back on their immediate return. I'm delighted to have Barnaby back to give us an update on the ongoing debate. Hello and welcome, Barnaby.
Hi, Nick. Lovely to be back. Thank you.
Good to see you again. It's a debate that says so much about the current mood, the West coming to terms with its colonial legacy. I had an interesting conversation with one member of my family who will remain nameless, and he said, "Who'd be interested in that?" Which sort of indicates, I think, the degree of sensitivity, particularly among older people, about sort of tackling our past. Just give us a quick recap about the pieces themselves. What are they, and then how are they stolen? Just to remind people, I know we spoke to you 2 years ago, and most people will have watched you during that discussion.
Sure, Nick. So the Benin Bronzes come from the ancient West African kingdom of Benin, which is found in modern-day Nigeria, southern Nigeria, confusingly not from the Republic of Benin, which is a former French colony, which was known as Dahomey, which is immediately to the west. This is a kingdom which flourished for 500 years, which interacted peacefully with Europeans from the 15th century onwards. But in the late 19th century, by which time, of course, Britain was the preeminent colonial power on the West African coast, and earlier powers like the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French had dropped away to a certain extent. British interests, commercial interests, which were primarily around palm oil, was starting to get more and more frustrated by the Oba, the king of Benin. I'm simplifying a complex story. But in 1897, the British sent a punitive expedition in retaliation for the killing of some British officials, and they sack the kingdom of Benin. They incorporate it into a protectorate, a new British protectorate, which is along the Niger coast. They send the Oba, the king, into exile. And in the process, they loot what are known as the Benin Bronzes, thousands of objects, many of them very finely cast from metal, but it's a generic term which also refers to splendid ivory carvings. And these are brought back to Britain. They're put on show in the British Museum that same year in 1897. And broadly speaking, they cause a sensation, not only in this country, but across Europe. That's why Germany has so many. German curators buy up Benin Bronzes very, very quickly, almost immediately. And they challenge many of the assumptions of the age, which is that Africa is a place without history, Africa is a place of barbarism. And people struggle to reconcile these assumptions with what they can see, which is that these wonderful, intricate cast metal pieces, many of which evidently depict, for example, Portuguese soldiers in 15th century armor in enormous detail. So it's very, very apparent that those pieces must be several hundred years old, and presumably the civilization is even older. Anyway, jump forward 125 years to where we are today, and the Benin Bronzes, as you were suggesting in your introduction, have become emblematic, I think, of one aspect of the anguished debate we're having in the West over colonialism, race, imperial legacy. And that particular aspect is what to do with imperial loot, or specifically African loot, if you like, in our great museums.
Okay, we're going to jump forward a lot and presume that some people have got some knowledge of what we're talking about. The book tackles how different countries, and particularly the British Museum, have struggled to come to terms with it themselves. And there's legislation involved. There's, I think, a sense that if you start giving some of this stuff back, you're going to lose all of it, because there's so many other collections, not to mention those famous marbles that have historical complications and complications of acquisition. I want to try and break down what's happened since your book, because your book did have a big impact. You wrote it just you produced just 2 years ago now, is that right?
Actually, it actually came out first in April of last year, so just over
April
a year.
Of last year, right? Okay, yeah. April a year ago, yeah. But in that time, there've been quite a few reactions. Can you just summarize some of those, and then we'll pick away at those?
Yes. In summary, when I was writing the book, it concluded with an ongoing conversation between leading European museums and Nigeria over what to do with the Benin Bronzes. That debate was very, very live. It had exploded in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And there was a consensus amongst leading European museums, many of the crucial ones in Germany, and then other ones typically in this country, including the British Museum, a consensus that they would lend back a significant collection of Benin Bronzes, which would then be displayed in a, as for now, hypothetical new museum in Benin City, the ancient kingdom and capital of the Benin Empire, which is still there. There's still an Oba, by the way, who is the great-great-grandson of the man who the British toppled. So there is that continuity in Nigeria, it's important to say. Anyway, that consensus on lending existed. Since then, that consensus has been ripped apart and positions have moved to the extent that every or almost every museum within the Benin Dialogue group is now talking about giving back their Benin Bronzes and asking Nigeria whether they can keep any on loan, with the conspicuous exception of the British Museum. And again, just to put it in context, the British Museum has the most Benin Bronzes of any museum in the world, almost 1,000. And of course, it has an amazing symbolic resonance in this debate because it is the national museum of the country, which carried out the sacking, the looting of Benin.
So, Barnaby, what changed in that time? And I'm going to one of the examples you've quoted recently is the director of the Smithsonian, which she's South African, and her stance is, I don't want to have. I want to get rid of these things as quickly as possible. Basically, they're tainted. There's no justification for us to have stolen art here. Just as there's no justification to hold pictures that were being stolen by the Nazis during the Holocaust, which is seen as quite a reasonable comparison.
Yeah, I suppose she's a good example. She's called Ngeri Blankenberg. She's relatively young. I think she's in her 40s, and she is probably quite a good example of a younger generation of museum curator who has a different outlook on this issue than their predecessors. So I think it's partially a generational change within academia. I think it's also, changes are bubbling away in societies below the surface, and then suddenly the dam breaks, and suddenly the moral consensus on what is acceptable is no longer there. So the British Museum, until a few years ago, would give a robust defense of the idea of the universal museum, where you can still, admire all of humankind's civilizations in comparison and get an.
That's something that Neil MacGregor would say, as the famous director until 2016 of the museum, or maybe it was earlier.
Exactly, and I would say he was a very confident and eloquent exponent of that position. What I sense now from the British Museum is a crisis of confidence because they don't talk. It's almost like they don't know what to say. I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a journalist was in London last week from National Geographic, and he'd flown in, an eminently respectable publication, writing a huge piece on restitution around the world, from Native America, just on an extensive tour of West Africa, had a really, put a huge amount of time and resources in, and nobody from the British Museum would speak to him. And that is very typical. And I think probably, as I told you last time, I think I went into this project thinking of the British Museum as this, this great confident institution that is, almost arrogant. And the more I've got to know it, I see it as a divided organization that is very much on the back foot and which doesn't know the way forward. In fact, one thing that has changed, of course, in the interim, is the COVID pandemic. And I think that we can talk about British politics if you like. That I think that weakens the British Museum's position further.
How so? Why do you? I'm really interested in that point. Why do you think the pandemic had an effect?
Because if you go on to the British Museum's public financial records, you can anyone can find them on the web. You'll see that its commercial revenue, its revenue at the gate, fell 97% last year, and that was made up, for which the trustees are very, very grateful, with emergency funding from the government. Now, without going to get too much into party politics about this, I think it's fair to say that in Britain, there is a government, unlike that in Germany, perhaps especially the new government in Germany, but it would seem to a large degree, in fact, unlike President Macron in France, and the way the Smithsonian has gone, it would seem unlike the administration in America. There is a government in this country which is almost uniquely unsympathetic to this idea of breaking up national collections. And that puts the British Museum very much on the back foot. Nadine Dorries is the culture secretary. She's not someone who is at, how can I put it? She's not someone at the progressive end of these discussions about empire and race and colonialism.
I find this really interesting because this is obviously this is the book you wrote was about the bronzes themselves, but it's symbolic. The issues become bigger than that. On the one hand, you've got museums and countries saying we've got to do the right thing. And then here we are in the UK, a country with a strong imperial past, and one that's saying, in actual fact, why the hell should we have to be guilty for all of this? Can we just go back a few decades? There was legislation, I think this really was connected with the Elgin Marbles, introduced in 1963, that prevented the British Museum, actually law and parliament directly about affecting the British Museum, about its collection. Just go back a bit to explain why that came about.
Yeah, that's an important bit of context. So I think that was, 1963, the British Museum Act. As you say, it essentially prohibits the British Museum from making permanent returns from its collection. It has freedom. Curators and trustees have freedom over loans, a lot of freedom, but they cannot break up the collection. I don't think people who passed the law in 1963 envisaged where we would be today. Mm-hmm. In subsequent decades, and you'll hear this many times from Greece, for example. I used to live in Athens, so I can see the parallels and the differences between the debates around the Parthenon marbles and the Benin Bronzes. In subsequent decades, the British Museum's directors and trustees and curators would always be accused of hiding behind the law, using the law as an excuse. And I think there's some validity in that. I've been through the British Museum trustee minutes of the 1970s, when in fact there was a big campaign from Nigeria at that time. It barely registered in Britain, obviously. The big campaign in Nigeria at that time to get back a key Benin bronze item, a particularly wonderful ivory mask. And the trustees, the curators, the directors are utterly inflexible. In fact, ironically, the British government in the 1970s, particularly the Labour government of James Callaghan, of Harold Wilson and James Callaghan, is pleading with the British Museum to be more flexible on returning objects to Africa. Ghana as well crops up. And the British Museum just bats them away with this extraordinary arrogance. I suppose I'm using all this by way of example to show how the world has changed. Now, I don't think hiding behind the Act is an excuse. I think the Act is a political reality, and it constrains, it traps some of the people in the British Museum who would like to change their policies, but who know that they ultimately can't do anything unless there is a vote in Parliament. And this returns to what I was saying, which is, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm saying that from an objective political analysis, it is difficult to see that vote passing in this Parliament under its current configuration.
Yet at the same time, the museum's looking at an audience people coming to it. They're much younger, and it's there's, on the one hand, it's got funding coming from government, which has been its principal funding during the pandemic. Yet it's got legitimacy, a question of legitimacy. And whilst some members of my family would think that the museum shouldn't do a thing or maybe lend the Benin Bronzes back to Nigeria, that's not going to wash with the younger generation.
It's not. It doesn't wash online. Where we're all connected and people are tweeting furiously around the world.
Well, what did Boris Johnson say about it? I mean, I know during as the pandemic was raging, when the museums reopened, very conscious that they needed to get people back in after being closed. The museum actually relabeled the Benin Bronzes collection, being very explicit about the way that the loot had been taken.
Yes, this was symptomatic of the struggles that were going on within the British Museum over how to adapt. So you're absolutely right. Prior to the pandemic, the panel, the wording of next to the panel of Benin plaques in the Salisbury Room in the British Museum read something like the discovery of Benin art by the Western world. And now, I'm going to paraphrase, but it says, the looting and pillage of Benin by the British. And it's very, very explicit. So those sorts of changes, if you like, airing one's dirty laundry in public, are happening. At the same time, the Conservative government wrote a letter. This was Oliver Dowden, the previous Culture Secretary, but as I say, Nadine Dorries is, perhaps more conservative on these issues maybe than her predecessor. But Oliver Dowden wrote a letter that had a kind of thinly veiled threat that said, don't forget, he wrote this to the national collections, don't forget essentially where your income is coming from. We don't want to see too much, bowing and scraping to political fashions of the day, if you like.
Boris Johnson called it an orgy of national embarrassment.
He did, exactly. All I would say about Boris Johnson, though, Nick, is I also think he's quite pragmatic. And he has to sell this idea as something called global Britain. And a lot of things in this story are very unpredictable. Things are happening with Benin Bronzes that I never predicted 2 years ago.
Let's talk about some of those things, because your book talked notably about what the French did, which was with the Savoy report, that basically the French said, right, there's no justification for holding any artifacts in our museum that have been seized during the colonial occupation in Africa. It was a massive report, and it seemed like a sort of an earthquake for basically for an example for other states to follow, other museums to follow. And then more recently, Germany has made what decision? What has Germany decided to do?
So Germany has honed in. Well, Germany has made a number of decisions actually, and there will be a pretty extraordinary ceremony in Berlin tomorrow, which will be a political signing where Germany is agreeing to transfer the ownership of over 1,000 Benin Bronzes that come from the 5 biggest collections in Germany. It's Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Stuttgart, and Dresden, Leipzig, which is a single collection. So that is almost all the Benin Bronzes in Germany are being transferred to Nigerian ownership. This is extraordinary. There have been a number of other symbolic transfers as well. There was an object just this week that has been transferred to Cameroon. There have been objects transferred to Namibia as well. Of course, within these countries, France and Germany, there are many people who are not satisfied, who are saying, these don't go far enough, or this is, whatever the equivalent of greenwashing or whitewashing is in this context. And Germany isn't facing up to its own genocides in Namibia or in, which was Southwest Africa, or in Tanganyika, and it's making a big song and dance about the Benin Bronzes because Germany doesn't have that immediate guilt, if you like, and that puts the issue back on the British. So that's what's happening in Germany. I think what we haven't talked about, Nick, as well, is what all this means in Nigeria, because actually There'll be this.
I was going to come on to that, and I was just holding back for a second because the complications there are numerous, and really that's the in a way a massive issue. But just before we come to this, you just tell me what the attitude has been. Can you now buy and sell Benin Bronzes on the open market? What's the attitude there in terms of its commercial viability? And I think of ivory in my background. If you think of, there are some artifacts, you can no longer do this. This is unethical. What's the situation with that?
Well, so it's a little bit different with ivory, because ivory, there is a law now in this country. An issue like Benin Bronzes, it's ethical and moral. And what you are seeing is definitely the likes of Christie's and Sotheby's and Bonhams responding to that pressure, sometimes a little bit disingenuously, I would say. You will still see objects, and there's almost like a suggestion that they may be of great antiquity, but a rather formulaic denial that they are not associated with 1897 and the loot of 1897, because that is seen as toxic, to use the fashionable word, in reputational terms. I think that's also starting to affect prices as well on the private market. That's what dealers will
Okay, so it's beginning to have an impact. Well, let's turn to Nigeria now. And I mean, your book is brilliant, and also what you've written about more recently. There's an article in Apollo that you wrote about the sort of in political divisions over how the collection should be handled. But there are also other aspects that one needs to think about. But just to start with, I presume so far the Nigerians must be very happy. The state of Edo must be very happy about the way things are going.
Yeah, in broad terms, people are delighted, and perhaps I would emphasize surprised. I think this is important to say. I think institutions in Nigeria, and indeed in other parts of Africa, and leaders and Africans, are caught slightly off balance, because this is a movement, unlike previous demands for restitution, which were quite strong in Africa in the post-independence era, like the 1960s and 70s. This has been driven, as I was saying earlier, really by convulsions in our own society here in the West. In other words, Africa, which has been knocking on a door for decades and rather used to being ignored, suddenly that door's wide open, and they're caught rather off balance. Nigeria is a good example. And there are competing interests in Nigeria and layers of complication, because there's still an Oba, as I said, the great-great-grandson, a royal family, a man ultimately with enormous moral authority in what might happen to Benin Bronzes. But there's a local state administration, there's a federal administration, and they all have their own agendas. And of course, as I write in the original book, and it's very important to say this, Nigerian museums have an unhappy history in the post-independence period. And Nigerian museums, and this rarely crops up in some of the more sort of polemical writings around this issue. Nigerian museums have a superb collection of ancient artifacts and a superb collection of Benin Bronzes, and not one of the size of the British Museum, but one of extraordinary quality for reasons I go into in the book. And in many cases, they've done a very poor job at displaying them. And in some notorious cases, they failed to prevent their theft back onto the Western art market, or indeed back into Western museums. And in fact, ironically, there will be this great ceremony in Berlin tomorrow. But when you talk to the Nigerian museum curators, they say, we don't have the capacity to take back what is now being offered. We've got nowhere to put it. In fact, we're delighted that there's a recognition of historical wrong, if you like. We're delighted that ownership transfers to us, but the vast majority of these objects are going to be staying in Germany. Well, when other British museums move along this way, and by the way, exclusively, I can tell you it's very likely that in the autumn of this year, several major British collections, I'm not talking about the British Museum, but several major collections with the British collections will move in the same way. The majority of those objects are going to stay where they are for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, you refer, there's a dispute between the governor and the Oba about who should house that collection, and there's also uncertainty over if the governor loses the election or doesn't win the election next time round. He's been the main partner with museums in Europe. So who carries on that relationship? Nigerian politics motivated by often by money, patriarchy, and ethnic allegiances. All of that comes into it.
Absolutely, and I don't mean to say for one moment that there is an enormous moral and spiritual importance in Nigeria around the potential return of these objects. But there's also ego, there's politics, there's the suspicion or possibility that people might be able to make a lot of money through this process. And that is all bubbling away under the surface, undoubtedly. And in Benin City itself, there is this really unfortunate division where there was this idea of it has a grand title, the Edo Museum of West African Art. And it has attracted this star architect, Sir David Ajayi, who's Anglo-Ghanaian, who built the famous Smithsonian African-American History Museum. And he's on board with that. And its original idea was that it was going to be, the place where Benin Bronzes were returned to. And without wanting to go into the complex politics of Edo State, the Oba is not on board with that project at all and sees it as a way of hijacking his patrimony. And he wants there to be what he calls a Benin Royal Museum.
Yeah.
And you can understand his point of view, but the Benin Royal Museum seems to exist only on paper, and its trustees are remarkably coy about what money, if any, has been raised to build a proposed new museum. So it's going to be messy in Nigeria, undoubtedly.
Barnaby, you're brilliant at exploring all the nuances. And one of the things you highlight is the needs of Benin City, of the needs of Edo State. I mean, you've seen people being trafficked to southern Italy. There was a chap who came and met you at your hotel in Benin, and who was campaigning to try and stop people from leaving, because the vast majority of the people you've come across have come from Edo State. Just talk about the state's needs and how that sort of fits with the idea of having an international museum and all the attention. I mean, how do they relate to that?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the tragic things about Edo State, which is where Benin City is that criminal gangs who are involved in the trafficking of women, particularly for prostitution in Italy, and this has been going on for
decades,
30 years. I mean, I was doing stories on it when I lived in Nigeria more than 20 years ago. They have a very strong a stranglehold, if you like. There are other criminal gangs who have a strong hold on the trafficking of men across the Sahara onto boats through Libya. You've seen all those stories. That's all symptomatic of unemployment and poverty. And you meet many people in Benin City who will say, why are we building a new museum? How is that going to improve our lives immediately and in the short term? And any money that goes into a museum is money presumably that doesn't go into schools and doesn't go into hospitals. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask, is how much weight are we putting on the shoulders of these small objects, and what do we expect to be better when they go back? And that debate carries on in Nigeria, I think, with a good deal more nuance and honesty, in fact, than it does here in the West.
Yeah, I remember you saying on one of your first trips to Benin, you almost were killed by someone lobbing a brick at your windscreen because there was a tactic of using that highway basically to derail or knock cars off the road and then rob the occupants once they've crashed.
Absolutely. I think one of the British Museum's defences, although as I've been suggesting, they feel so unconfident they won't even make these defences, so I almost have to say it for them. Of course, one of their defences is that in pre-COVID times, and hopefully in the near future, 6 million people visit the British Museum every single year and admire these wonderful sculptures and all its other treasures. And with the best will in the world, 6 million visitors will never go to Nigeria or on to Benin City. That's just not going to happen, obviously.
Great. Let's start taking some questions. There's so much more to talk about. I've got lots more questions, but let's start bringing some questions from people around the world. Lois Towart, who is in Australia. Go ahead, Lois.
I've added a new sort of dimension from down under. We've also got a bit of a problem with some of the stuff in your British museums, because you've taken particularly human remains, and some of these human remains still have living relatives who can name the people who are basically, it's a bit like somebody telling you we've got a skeleton of your great-grandmother in the museum and we're displaying it. That's sort of like there's been requests to have stuff returned, or particularly human remains returned. But it adds another dimension because it actually really challenges what the museum's about. Most museums, whenever you go to them, whatever country you're in, are basically, this is our history and this is, basically stuff from here. Whereas, the British Museum is there's a lot of the stuff that we stole. So it actually totally challenges what the museum's completely about. I mean,
But Lois, are you saying all museums are just about sort of national patrimony, or whatever it's called?
I kind of like museums. I know you don't like museums because they're full of old stuff, but they're often full of how we interpret who we are.
But what I would say to that, Lois, I absolutely hear what you're saying. In fact, the law in Britain on human body parts in museums has changed, as indeed it has changed in relation to loot that was taken by the Nazis and wherever they took it before and during the Second World War. So in other words, there have been important legal exemptions to that British Museum Act and to other acts which control our national collections. So we can make changes, laws can change. And this is one of the arguments that is put forward by people who are especially concerned about the Benin Bronzes or the Magdala treasures, which were looted in another infamous British military expedition in the 1860s in what was Abyssinia, from the Ashanti in Ghana, which was the Gold Coast as well. And in fact, I can't say how many have gone back from the British Museum. I do know of some human remains that recently went back from Manchester to Australia.
Okay, I think we've got a question that actually just picks up on what you were saying, Barnaby. So Magdala expedition, 1868. So Hookie Walker's got a question to that. Hookie, does that answer your question? Hookie, are you there?
Yes. Am I unmuted now? Yes.
You're there, yeah.
No, I only put the question down when we were concentrating so much on Benin. I thought there was nowhere else in the world. I'm a co-signatory of a letter to the museum calling for the return to Ethiopia of loot from the Magdala expedition. I don't think it helps this discussion very much, except to point out that it's not just Benin and now Lois's point. It's pretty well worldwide. We haven't. The
National Army Museum gave back bits of hair chopped off. I'm trying to remember. The point is, but if the National Army Museum did it, and I'd expect that to be one of the most conservative institutions out there. But I know related to body parts, you might expect the British Museum to be a bit more flexible.
Yes. Well, sorry, just to complete, I can't help on the attitude of the British Museum, because we employed a QC to argue that the British Museum had the right to return things, and as the letter went from the QC, the museum tended to reply, well, we haven't had a letter from the principal, so we're not going to reply to an agent, which wasn't very helpful.
I think all I would say is that the Magdala, the Benin Bronzes, the Santahini from Ghana, Gold Coast, these are relatively clear-cut ones, and that's perhaps relatively clear-cut issues because they were looted in a military expedition. There's no doubt about that. And that's why they've attracted a lot of attention, and in some cases, particularly the Benin Bronzes, why there's been a lot more movement on them. What I guess is much more problematic and is the kind of the grey area is far more typical of what was taken during the colonial period, and that will be a missionary so-and-so paid £5 for it 10 years after the British Protectorate was established. Anthropologist on a collecting expedition took so-and-so, and now 100 years later, those people say they're not happy with that transaction and it didn't happen under equitable conditions and there was a degree of coercion, and you can imagine the sort of debates that go on about that, and those ones are much harder to resolve, if indeed they ever can be to anybody's satisfaction, much more complicated, whereas I think people feel the military looting ones are much more straightforward.
I mean, there's the moral ambiguity here, which you've touched upon, is highlighted. There's a question here from Elaine Moore, who's got COVID, as has my daughter, and she's ensconced up in the attic in this house. I'm COVID-free. Are there any governments offering financial reparations in addition to returning the stolen objects, which could pay for museums, facilities, and training? The British Museum does a huge amount of work already, and does a huge amount of training, and does, I mean, it's been very helpful with Nigeria in terms of trying to set up this specific museum. But there is an extent to which it's trying to bear the whole weight of our colonial legacy on its shoulders because it's a museum and the artifacts are there.
I think that's true. I mean, they're in the firing line, undoubtedly. There's a huge archaeological project going on in Benin City at the moment with the British Museum, working with the Germans. I know that the Germans are having quite advanced discussions about how they might help fund institutions to which Benin Bronzes from Germany are going to return. But yeah, you'll certainly hear many voices in Nigeria and beyond saying return isn't enough. We want reparations.
And are there any discussions in Nigeria about giving reparations to descendants of slaves who they sold in return for Portuguese metal, or they return for money when they were sold off to slave traders in the Caribbean?
In a word, no, I've not seen much evidence of that.
Oh, the point is, it's complex, isn't it? It's not that simple.
It's complex, yes. I think it's important to say that Benin actually, when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, and you're opening up a huge debate there. Benin was relatively peripheral in the transatlantic slave trade. This is how I'm worming my way off the hook here. But I think the degree of justification, it was always a very inconvenient place for Europeans to get slaves from, which is not to say that there weren't periods when the Obbers wanted to sell slaves to the Europeans. There were also hundreds of years when the Obbers did not want to sell slaves to Europeans. So the trade ebbed and flowed. But the point is, it's not on the coast. You've got to take ships inland. You've got to wait a long time. West Africa was the white man's grave. Everyone would fall ill with malaria and all sorts of diseases that they didn't know anything about. And it was simply more trouble than it was worth. That's why so many more slaves were taken from the coast itself, and from the Ghana coast as well. It's much easier to co-opt local elites.
Okay. So following up on this, I mean, we're not going to make you wriggle for even longer. Simon Jackson's got a question that sort of follows up on this, and this is the question of time. Go on, Simon.
By what criteria might we address the question of how far we go back with this? I mean, whether the Spanish should return treasure looted from the Incas by the conquistadors, or the Italians from the Roman sack of Carthage. The latter seems a step too far, but what defines the line?
Well, I mean, your question gets to the essence of it. Clearly, we have. This is what I've asked British Museum trustees and other curators. Clearly, we have drawn a line because we have rewritten or introduced legislation around the Second World War and loot that was taken by the Nazis. So where is that line? 1939? 1900 maybe? Well, Benin was looted in 1897. It's very, very close to 1900. Or is that line geographical? Does it go somewhere through the Mediterranean? These aren't easy questions or comfortable questions for people to answer.
It's fascinating. Do put in more questions there. Sorry for the distraction there. Our shopping's just been delivered, and somebody else is unloading it. Can you talk about how things have been badly handled? There's an example more recently of a series of looted sort of statue heads in Belgium, which you picked up on. They were taken to, I think, William Wallace were presented with one particular head. Just what happened there?
This is an example. This all began actually with the robbery from a Nigerian museum in 1987. Nigerian museums suffered a series of dramatic robberies in the 80s and 90s. And yes, you might say that they were driven and organized by dealers in the West, but undoubtedly Nigerian museum staff collaborated with them to some extent. In this particular instance, an Ife head, which are these amazing bronze cast heads which come from a neighboring civilization to Benin, an Ife head was stolen. It turned in 1987. It turned up in 2017 in London when a Belgian man tried to sell it to William Wallace, a very reputable auction house. William Wallace noticed that it was on a UNESCO list as having been stolen in 1987. It has now transpired that the Belgian government sold it in 2007, 20 years after it was stolen, to a Belgian antiques dealer for 200 euros. Now, this raises so many questions as to how did the piece end up in Belgium? What did the man know who bought it for 200 euros? Why did he then sit on it for 10 years and then try and pass it on to William Wallace, who valued it incidentally at £20 million if they could sell it on the open market? William Wallace did the right thing and handed it over to the Metropolitan Police, who've held it for the last 5 years. It's sitting in a storage facility somewhere in London. The Nigerians, of course, are incandescent and want it back. But the Belgian antique dealer is saying he has legal title because he bought it from the Belgian government in a sale of confiscated items that was being sold off on the cheap. He bought it for 200 euros. He has the receipt. So the British are saying we're neutral. Our private preference might be for it to go back to Nigeria, but this has to be resolved between the Belgian dealer and the Nigerians. So it's a very tangled story.
I can see how the police justification is that it's about ownership. What are reasons for not giving it back to Nigeria?
Their justification is that the Belgian man seems to have legal title. The Nigerians also have a very strong case
because it was sold at a Belgian state auction of stolen property.
Sold at a Belgian state auction. Yeah. He has all the and the Belgian government admits this, by the way. So he has all the certification to prove this. So there are two competing owners, and the British police are worried that if they give it to one, they'll be liable to prosecution from the other. So they are hoping that this can be resolved between them. So
there's you can understand their reticence, their holding back.
I can understand their reticence. Yes, what they are arguing is that somebody should pay off this Belgian dealer, who at one point seemed to have been asking for 5 million euros. He's now asking for 39,000 euros. And the British are suggesting that as the Belgians made such a mess in the first place, the Belgian government should pay off the Belgian dealer. It's got a bit more complicated because Nigeria has taken Britain to a special UNESCO panel which deals on contested art. So it's gone on, and it seems resolvable, it was just a pity. I mean, and that actually brings me right back to the Benin Bronzes themselves. I'm convinced that this is not a zero-sum game. I think everybody can win here in this situation. In the case of the Benin Bronzes, unlike, say, the Parthenon marbles or very particular single items which are uniquely contested, there are thousands of Benin Bronzes. I think the Oba and the Nigerians want the recognition of a historical wrong. They want some symbolic returns, and they do want Benin Bronzes to be, in their own words, ambassadors of their culture. going around the world. They would also like to see, incidentally, some sort of remuneration, some sort of financial return out of their objects being exhibited around the world.
I'll come back to the British Museum, which is the outlier, in a second, and what their dilemma is in terms of the precedent. We talked about government funding as well. But other smaller institutions have just gone ahead and dealt with it. You've witnessed a few, you've witnessed Jesus College. Just tell me what you've seen in the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, I could show you some pictures, actually, if you want.
Go on, you can share the screen, go on.
I can share the screen, okay. All right, well, let's whiz through some pictures. Okay, so this, for people's benefit, of course, this is 1897. This is a sort of iconic picture of the British military, mainly sailors, in the Oba's palace with their Benin loot. And here they are loading it up onto the donkeys where it's taken down to the British ships. This particular donkey belonged to a famous war correspondent, man called Seppings Wright, who was there for the Illustrated London News and gave lots of Benin Bronzes to his editor, who passed them on to the British Museum. And here's Oba Ovenramwen being taken off into exile by the British. He'll never see his kingdom again. He dies in exile in 1914. You can see the
there chains. He is, literally in chains. Yeah.
He's in chains. See the chains around his ankle. See that look of cold fury on his face. He dies in exile, and then once he's dead, the British put his son on the throne as a sort of more of a figurehead or puppet, if you're being unkinder. And so the dynasty is still there. This is the piece that was returned from Jesus College, Cambridge, in October of last year, a cockerel that was taken by a man called George Neville, a very interesting man, in fact, not a soldier, a banker in Lagos who joined the expedition and took an extraordinary haul. And I think students at Jesus College, Cambridge, this is again indicative of change in our national institutions. A newer generation of students of African heritage in Jesus College have been campaigning on this for some years. Jesus College.
Stay with this one just for a second, because what's the there have been letters to the Telegraph from the other side, haven't there?
There have been, yeah. There's a man called Francis Bown, who I got to know, who's an old. Are you called an old Jesuit? I'm not sure. I think you probably are. Who's led a sort of half-hearted rearguard against Jesus giving back this object, but I think he felt he was always onto a losing cause, to be honest. And Sanita Elaine, who is the president, or is she the master of Jesus? I think they call them the president. Perhaps not coincidentally, the first woman of African heritage to run an Oxbridge college. When she came in, things moved quite quickly, and so Jesus gave back this cockerel in October last year, and the following day, Aberdeen University gave back this Benin head, and I was invited to the ceremony up in Benin, and this is the current Oba's brother, Prince Yaradua, receiving the head, which was taken back. So in other words, Britain had refused to give back any Benin Bronzes for 125 years, and quite suddenly it gave back two within 2 days. Just
go back to that. Didn't have to literally go back, but talking about Jesus, the chap who wrote the Telegraph said, you should know this. If we're going to examine all the artifacts in our museums and their history and judge them ethically on that basis, nobody should give any donations to museums any longer.
I think that he was saying no one will want to give anything to my old college any longer, because this was a gift. This was a gift from George Neville I think it was in 1905, and as he put it, generations of Jesuits had sat beneath this cockerel in the Jesus Hall and had enjoyed it. And what would be the incentive for people to give back? And there has been, a wider debate around Jesus College and receiving money from the Chinese, and a different debate. I think there's is it a plaque or a portrait of somebody associated with the slave trade as well? So,
Barnaby, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you see that somebody what's the motivation for somebody who's making that assessment? Are they trying to be, if I was going to be judgmental, I'd call that being sort of morally blind, ethically blind. What's the motivation behind it?
Well, behind the motivation of the guy who was saying that we shouldn't.
Yeah, there's a defensiveness to that, isn't there?
I think there is a defensiveness. Yes, I mean, I think his argument was that this was given in this wouldn't happen today. This was given in different circumstances, and it's completely ahistorical to judge the actions of the past with today's morality. And as somebody said, and it's a fair point. Somebody just rightly said, where is the line? Of course we draw that line. Rome is not giving back to ancient Greece. Venice is not giving back to Istanbul, to Constantinople, all the rest of it. So a line is drawn, and where are we drawing it? It just seems that we are redrawing that line at the moment. Perhaps we're redrawing it further back in time. Perhaps we're redrawing it. We're extending its geographical scope, and that is a very difficult and an anguished process.
Yeah, fascinating.
And here, just for people's benefit, of course. So that those are the plaques in the British Museum. For those who've had the benefit to see them, they're free. Do go and see them. Of course, that they depict those wonderful Portuguese soldiers you can see in the middle that I was alluding to. And if you go and see these plaques, read the panel on the left. It has been comprehensively rewritten, and if it's for your amusement, I can send you what it used to say as well, and you can compare and contrast. So this is the British Museum's concession to change, if you like.
If you've got any more questions, people do ask. I'm going to get slightly ahead of myself. I'm hoping that we're going to do a short study tour in London that looks at this issue, because I think Barnaby's book examines so many different facets of this question, and it's not, as we've discussed here, it's not just about the bronzes themselves. It's about the West's relationship with its past, but also how Nigeria deals with this and Nigeria's own needs. And I think when I was rereading parts of your book, the thing that really struck me was the miserable stories of trafficking of people trying to escape from their own sort of circumstances and seek a better life in the West, and going across the Sahara and really getting enslaved. And it covers all of that. And I'd love to do something that examines all of these issues. What are we looking at here?
So here you are looking. You're looking at two of the absolute finest treasures of the British Museum. Sorry, Nick, I was just flicking through seeing what I had as you were talking. Yeah. They're both thought to depict Queen Idia, who was we believe, a 15th century queen of Benin, or a queen mother, in fact. This is a bronze sculpture. And when a man called Ormond Dalton, who was in charge of, or one of the curators in the Africa department in 1897, when he got hold of this, he said, as if from ancient Greece. This is cast like all the finest Benin bronzes using the lost wax method, which is a very, very, or cire perdu as it's called in French, a very, very difficult, sophisticated method, especially when you're doing it with very, very thin metal. And then here, this is an object of enormous emotional symbolism. Also Queen Idia. This is ivory, believed to be 15th century ivory. I find a piece of extraordinary beauty, of evocative beauty. And it depicts, if you look at the Queen's headdress, you can see the faces or the profiles of, is it 10 or 11 Portuguese explorers going around her headdress there, which is wonderful. And I'd alluded when we were chatting earlier about a big dispute in the 1970s. In 1977, Nigeria hosted this huge festival of African art and culture, and it was a huge event for the broader Black diaspora. You had Stevie Wonder and Miriam Makeba, and they pleaded with the British Museum for this mask to be lent back for the duration of the festival. And they made it the symbol of the festival, which is called Festax. This mask is still commonly referred to as the Festac mask in Nigeria. And the British Museum absolutely refused. And they said that its safety and its care could not be guaranteed if it went back to Nigeria. And that still causes great pain and anger in Nigeria today.
So just to recap, Barnaby, what is now the position of the museum?
So the British Museum's public position is that they are actively involved in the Benin Dialogue Group, which brings together the leading museums working with the Nigerian authorities. They're involved in archaeology in Benin City, and they are willing to loan Benin an unspecified number of Benin bronzes and an unspecified items within their collection. They've drawn no distinction. I mean, the two items I've just shown you are two of the most, to use that dreaded word we all use these days, most iconic. So they're not drawing red lines around this mask or that head. They're saying they're open to generous discussions about loans, and that's where they are, and that in itself is very, very different to where they were a few years ago. Yet they are still deeply isolated. Watch this space. In fact, the head of Nigerian Museums is returning back through London after what will be his triumphant ceremony in Berlin tomorrow, and I know that he's got meetings with British Museum staff on Monday. So watch this space, basically.
Okay, I think we may have one more question coming up. I'm not too sure if we've got Diane Cook there with us. Are you there, Diane? I'm going to ask her a question for us. She says, not all objects are in museum. In time, we expect to see a disputed object on public display in London. The Kohinoor, what do you think? How do you think this will be handled? Do you know about this one?
I don't know. I don't know about the Kohinoor, no. I mean, all I would say to Diane, I don't know if this has any relevance, is I can see this in the case of when things are in museums, it's an awful lot easier than when they're held privately, basically. Yeah. I think it's much easier to resolve, and that saga of the Ife head we were talking about earlier is indicative of that. Museums are, political and public institutions which are part of the public discourse. If a reclusive and wealthy individual holds a particular piece of art and they're quite certain that they are on solid grounds legally, maybe not morally and ethically, then they have very little incentive to cooperate. And you see that with Benin Bronzes, and you see it with other objects as well. So there's actually, there's a lot of confusion and secrecy and rumours, for example, with Benin Bronzes as to how many are held by private individuals.
Libby Grimshaw, we can just squeeze you. And Libby, you've got something to say as well.
Yeah, so on going back to just the Benin Bronzes and that wonderful cock, at the very least, what are the financial and technological reasons why facsimiles cannot be made of these items in this day and age? What is the magic thing about it being the real one? If you want to show it.
So Libby, what's your argument? You think that to protect them? Surely, if you want to appreciate the art, shouldn't you be seeing the original thing? What's your argument against that, Libby?
My argument is that you can now make such good facsimiles that you can have an exhibition in the British Museum with facsimiles.
I'm saying, why should you?
In order to settle this whole moral question that you're dealing with. But this seems.
So you mean to keep a facsimile here and send the original back?
Yes, exactly.
Well, you're right. In fact, that is a solution which is being proposed by some people. In fact, there's a whole organisation, and somebody wrote to me from Nigeria yesterday, and this is what they specifically do. This they through 3D printing, they're making beautiful replicas. And perhaps that is the way forward. I think for those who are dispossessed, it's not enough. They want the originals. They want the authenticity, because this is.
I suggest they have the originals.
Understood. Yeah, sure. Well, that might be the way forward. You'll know, perhaps, for example, in Athens at the moment, if anyone's been to the amazing new Parthenon Museum, what the Greeks have done is a rather clever sort of hybrid where they display their Parthenon marbles, which are shaded slightly differently to the very good replicas they've made of what the British Museum have, and they put them together and show the whole frontispiece, the whole sculpture, if you like, and you can see what they have and what is in Britain. But making those facsimiles may be solution. Oh, by the way, sorry, this is a proposed wonderful new museum in Benin City that doesn't exist. So this is Sir David Ajayi's proposed museum, and it looks wonderful, but unfortunately the Oba is not on board with this project. So
I don't like it either. It looks like a big brick block to me.
Well, come on, look at that. Don't you like the look of that? It's okay. Anyway.
So I have one small thing. The two notches in the Queen's head, is that ceremonial? It looks like it's sort of been done after they were made on both those
stars, aren't they?
Models.
Yeah, those are ceremonial, yes. And that on the it would have been inlaid actually. Is that some with copper, some with iron? So a contrast between the original, between the metal and the ivory, but the inlays have come out, unfortunately. Great.
Barnaby, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyable talking to you again. And as I say, I hope we can get something together. So if anybody's in the UK, we will let you know. And hopefully we can get something running perhaps this autumn where we're going to look at many of the issues we've been talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. And if anyone's welcome to write to me, barnaby.phillips@gmail.com, and pick up on any of these issues, or, they're happy to carry on the debate.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Barnaby.
All right. Bye-bye.